calls to pray and to sing and to gather and to debate the issues of the day. And since the last Art and Christianity lecture, we have installed a major new permanent commission, art commission, by the Trinidad artist Che Lovelace. So as you come and go at the end of the lecture, please do have a look at the paintings that are in the narthex. There are 4 of them. If you just look up, you'll be able to see those. They were to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the baptism of Kwabna Otoba Kuguano, who was a prominent abolitionist in the 18th century and much under-narrated. So it was our privilege to be able to raise his voice and his story just at the end of last year. But it's really my duty just to welcome you and to welcome you to this historic place, as we're delighted to welcome the Art and Christianity lecturer for this year. I'm going to hand you over now to Paula Gooder, who's the chair of Art and Christianity, to introduce our lecturer. Thank you.
First and foremost, can I just say a very huge thank you to Lucy and the whole team here at St James's. It's a great privilege to be here, and I don't think the lecture would feel right in any other place, so it's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to you all for your warmth and hospitality. Also, can I just introduce myself? I am the brand new chair of Art and Christianity as of January a month ago, so very, very new. My name is Paula Gooder. I'm Canon Chancellor at St Paul's Cathedral, where I look after theology, learning and art. So the art bit is what makes it feel like a very good fit for me to be able to work with the fabulous team on art and Christianity. So as Lucy has said, this is the 2nd annual lecture for Art and Christianity. Last year, the inaugural lecture was given by Rebecca Salter from the Royal Academy. And so therefore, it is wonderful to be able to have the 2nd one. Let me just tell you a little bit about the evening, and then I will introduce to you our esteemed lecturer this evening. So Gus will give his lecture for around 40 minutes or so, and then there will be time for questions, and I hope so. Do be thinking of questions as he goes, because there will be plenty of time to reflect together at the end of his talk. And then, great news for you, there is wine. So if you manage to carry on all the way through the lecture and the questions, then there is wine to cheer your souls right at the end. Let me now introduce to you Gus Casely-Hayford. Gus is a wonderful, wonderful speaker and writer, and he is the inaugural director of the V&A East, who was appointed in March 2020. He's a curator and cultural historian who writes, lectures and broadcasts widely on culture. Having presented a large number of series for Sky, BBC Radio and Television, and many other channels as well. He has lectured widely on culture, including periods at Sotheby's, Goldsmiths, Birkbeck, City University, University of Westminster, and SOAS. Don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel tired even reading out your CV. He's advised national and international bodies on heritage and culture, including the United Nations and the Canadian, Dutch and Norwegian Arts Councils. He's a cultural fellow of King's College London, a fellow of Jesus College Cambridge, a member of the Creative UK Council and trustee of the Cartoon Thakur Foundation. And so many other things. I got his biography and had to cut a good portion of it out because I'd have been taking too long during his lecture introducing him. Gus, it's such an honour to have you with us this evening, and we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
All mine. Thank you so much, Paula, Lucy, Laura, everyone who has made this evening possible, and to all of you as well for coming out on this very cold and windy and rainy evening. I am, very touched. And the thing that drew me to really want to do this is it's a fantastic series, but also this amazing community, this incredible institution, and the history that it represents, not just in terms of as a church, but as a place that has always kind of fought for people who were marginal. That this is the place where abolitionists would gather. These are the places where many of the sorts of people who came, like my own dear parents, feeling kind of marginalized, this is the place that they sought out as a place of welcome. So I am just so touched and honored to be here. And before I start, I just wanted to talk a little bit about something which has been preying on my mind and on many of the staff at the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is, as you probably heard, a deposition from the cross. It's a tiny carved piece of walrus ivory, and it was crafted in England between about 1190 and 1200. We don't know who made it, but it was obviously made by someone of truly exceptional ability. It's unlike anything else in existence. And it captures a particular moment when Jesus' body is lifted down from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea. And it would once, looking at it, it would once have been part of a larger scene. If you've seen it at the V&A, you'll probably know that there are hints of a cross that has broken away. There are possible kind of areas that might suggest that this was part of a larger scene with other figures. But what we do know about it, even though it is somewhat enigmatic, is that we love it at the V&A, and it's sat on loan since 1982, and we have grown just so fond of it. But sadly, we may lose it. DCMS recently placed an export stop to avoid it being sent abroad, because we learned that it had been sold privately by Sotheby's to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for more than $2.5 million, on the condition that an export license was granted. And we are now working to raise the $2.5 million so that we can hopefully keep this as part of our collection. Keep this not for the V&A, but for our nation. We can't afford, either institutionally or as a nation, to lose objects like this that tell our particular story of Christianity. So if you can help, we would be so grateful. And what I actually love about this, having kind of wandered past it on so many occasions in the V&A and just stopped to gaze upon it, it is a beautiful thing. And it shows a naturalistic departure from the rather kind of static post-classical models of representations of Christ that represented him as victorious over death. But also it's different from the sort of more stylized Romanesque representations that exploited the emotive qualities of surface pattern to give a resounding image of God made man, slumped in death. This is about vulnerability. It's about fear and about weakness. It's about the things that we share as humans, but like Christ, that we can seek to overcome. And in this way, I think it anticipates the emotional empathy with the suffering of Christ that characterizes Gothic art and late medieval piety. It's such a special, such an important piece, tiny as it is. And it's also connected to some of the things I'd like to speak about today, about a kind of strength in vulnerability, about empathy, and that pervading, compassionate undergirding that I think is the fundamental theme of the New Testament. But first, I wanted just to start by saying greetings, because I want to tell you something of a festive story. And whilst you might think I'm a couple of months late, but I wanted to dedicate this to the followers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for whom this is the season of Jenna, or Christmas, or Timket, the Epiphany, the time of the baptism of Christ. Anyone who grew up in medieval Europe would have known that one of the three kings who visited the infant Jesus was African. And today, anyone who's grown up with any exposure to Christian symbolism, anyone who's received Christmas cards or visited the National Gallery in the Western world will probably know Balthazar, the African king. And when I say no, do we really know Balthazar? Who he was? Why he was important? The three wise men, they're all enigmatic, but all fascinating figures. Yet, in those three figures is encapsulated a powerful symbol, not just of the emerging political geography of the medieval world, of how a tripolar, intercontinental, connected super-economy was beginning to develop with Europe, Asia, and Africa as three equal areas, three equal territories that could all lay claim to having profound impact on the economic and intellectual advancement of the world. But also, there's a tacit understanding with that wisdom, that culture, that intellectual advancement, they aren't the preserve of a single region. There's an understanding that intellectual innovation and cultural sophistication are evident in cultures that existed beyond Europe. And great wealth and cultural advances are being made in a variety of different geographic arenas as a result. These weren't just three wise men. They represented a burgeoning multipolar capitalism of a new world. And that image of an interconnected medieval world, of an interconnected Africa as home of wealth, stability, intellectual endeavor, innovation, it might seem at odds with so much of what we conventionally teach our children today. But I'd like to investigate what that vision was based upon and explore why we no longer see Africa in that way. The idea of the African magus, it wasn't a fantasy. It was based upon elements of corroborable fact. Balthazar was a personification of a range of figures on the edge of ambient medieval consciousness, who offered a worldly, altered perspective that was attractive because in this age of burgeoning discovery, it suggested the potential that was simply far too exciting to resist. For Europeans, it implied that their future might be influenced by cultures that might lie beyond their continental boundaries. What they sought was not to literally find the Balthazar of the Bible, but to find figures who might step into those romantic shoes. And I'm interested in following that path in search of that charismatic, wise, wealthy African leader of faith. An important premise for understanding who Balthazar, the third king, was is to understand that Christianity was not in origin a purely Western European religion. Christianity comes out of the Middle East as a set of innovative ideas that could have been applied in a whole variety of ways. Early Christianity spread quickly from the Middle East. Within a handful of generations, pockets of followers had established themselves across and beyond the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Its radical, liberating ideas flowed easily along the burgeoning trade routes, aided by intensifying cultural exchange and increased literacy. As Christianity was being adopted as the state religion in Armenia in the 4th century, it was also being embraced by the court of King Azana, who would become the emperor of what is today Ethiopia. Most manifestations of the new religion were localized and particular, yet they were connected by a dynamic, rapidly growing set of interconnected beliefs and ideas. These were people who were advocates and believers who wanted to get out there and evangelize. They believed that they had in their hands ideas that might change the world. And it must, I think, from reading a little bit about it, it must have been thrilling to be alive in this period, to have witnessed this sense of urgency, this sense of potential. Azana's 4th century conversion in Ethiopia is well known and well documented by people right across the region. It was captured in the ecclesiastical writings of many respected contemporary scholars. Tyrannius Rufinus, Socrates Scholasticus. These are the superstars of the period, and they all write about this. Really interesting ideas being adopted by some of the most radical, some of the most charismatic politicians and leaders and aristocrats of the period. Rufinus describing how Frumentius, a shipwrecked Lebanese Christian intellectual, converted a generation of aristocratic Axumites, and so established a powerful dynasty that Ethiopians maintain to this day is the longest surviving continuous tradition of state-sponsored Christianity on earth. And if you visit there, you will see that in material culture, in buildings, but also in the kind of committed belief of the people. Azana's adoption of Christianity, and this is a gold coin from that period depicting him, was probably at least in part driven by his ambition to strengthen his trading relationships with the Roman Empire. And it would work. It would work really well. Frumentius would be canonized, and Azana would build a brilliant cosmopolitan court all around him. And if ever there was a model for Balthazar, it was Azana. He was wise, he was well-educated, wealthy, and globally ambitious. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the famous Greek sailor's guide to the ancient world, painted a vivid picture of Axum as a dynamic cultural hub with trading connections across East Africa and beyond to the Red Sea. It's the perfect platform for an inquisitive, myrrh-bearing magus to be piqued by the unusual constellation of stars in the eastern sky. That sense of the African state being the personification of a single outward-facing individual, someone who was both worldly and intellectual, would captivate people within and beyond the African continent. By the 12th century, when the Balthazar myth was absolutely at its height, there had begun to be an ambient fascination with the notion of the Prester John, who I'm sure you've heard a lot about. This is a legendary, wealthy Christian patriarch who was said to rule over a Christian nation somewhere in the global south. They depicted him as a descendant of one of the three magi. And the idea was that he ruled a kingdom that was full of riches, full of marvels and strange creatures. At first, there were suggestions that the Prester John might reside in India. But eventually, Portuguese explorers came to believe that the Prester John was an Ethiopian. And the most likely personification of the story is Lalibela. Now, Lalibela, he grows up in the region that produces the sweet-smelling myrrh. So the whole kind of, the story, the myth, it all begins to somehow link in with the reality, with the material culture, with the personalities. And if you've visited Ethiopia, you'll know this is an area with magnificent churches. And churches that are covered in the most exquisite iconography, but also a place that attracted but also produced wealthy travelers. So the charismatic Lalibela, who you'll see in that central image, and also kind of on the left, riding on a lion. He ascended to the Ethiopian throne, and it's a huge empire, but stable, trading, well-connected, well-educated. It's a really culturally confident state. But Lalibela, he wanted more than that. He sought to transform his kingdom into the center of intellectual innovation, an exemplar of scholarship and a magnet for the very finest minds of the age. In a time of growing popularity of Islam, Lalibela wanted to reassert his empire's Christian values. And he wants to reconnect with the trading allies that he thought, with trading allies across Christendom. So he went on a very public diplomatic pilgrimage to the Holy Land, traveling in great style, the sort of style that would get noticed. Unfortunately, it didn't go as planned. He didn't actually return to the, he didn't actually get to the Holy Land in the way that he had hoped. It doesn't go well, and he comes home enraged, really upset, because in that period, Jerusalem has been lost to the Muslims. The route is enormously kind of compromised, and so he finds it very difficult to get there, and he returns with a great deal of frustration. But he vows then that he's going to do something equally ambitious. He's going to build a new city that is a worthy replacement for the Holy Land. So he commissions the construction of a place of pilgrimage on an Ethiopian mountainside, a new fitting center of worship that would mean that Ethiopians, Africans, Christians who lived in that region would not have to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. They could stay, they could visit Ethiopia to this new center of Christendom, Lalibela. He wanted to found a city, a holy city that felt worthy of this new moment. And so he wants to create an architectural statement that is unlike anything that's ever been seen before. And anyone who's visited will know that he succeeded. The mountain refuge of Lalibela is extraordinary. I mean, I have traveled all over Africa. I did a series for the BBC two series called Lost Kingdoms of Africa, and visited some astonishing sites. But Lalibela, I've got to say, is one of the places that absolutely took my breath away. And this is building construction of a different order than anything I'd ever seen before. He conceived a new kind of center of Christendom in the most dramatic of forms. He simultaneously commissions 13 churches. The Lalibela churches, they're not constructed in any conventional sense. That these are carved, hewn from solid crimson sandstone out of the Ethiopian highlands. And it's part geography, part sculpture. And even today, it's difficult to imagine how, even with modern machinery, how you would craft something of this level of ambition. They are truly breathtaking. And it was a display of power as well as devotion. And he had to gather thousands of builders, of hundreds of architects to support, to craft this amazing new constellation of churches. And it is a statement about wealth, about ambition, about religious dedication, and he did so in peerless terms. So I think he's a kind of worthy inspiration for our Balthazar, a very powerful symbol of dedicated Christianity, the kind of figure who would inspire generations of European travelers who were in search of the Prester John, in search of that descendant of Balthazar. Marco Polo, looking for the mythical Prester John, he immediately thinks, this is the region, Ethiopia, where I'm going to find him. What they are looking for is someone who, if they can't lead an assault on Jerusalem, would be able to in some way financially sponsor it. And indeed, in 1306, 30 Ethiopian ambassadors who were serving in the emperor's court, they visit Europe and they take with them some of the amazing illuminated manuscripts to show to some of their peers in Europe. And they are written about as being part of the court of Prester John, that they see these people as being in some way descendants of the great Magi. It's fascinating how myth, legend, how stories of kind of from the Bible are connected, woven into contemporary writing. But the other characteristic of Balthazar and the other wise men was their wealth. They brought gifts that astonished and amazed, and that demonstrated the dynamically shifting world of ideas and trade. And that sense of the wealthy innovator was probably best personified by an African who came to the throne 150 years after Lalibela and on the other side of the continent. This is St. George's, which is at the center of Lalibela. I'll just finish on that, which is an absolutely extraordinary church that, as I said, hewn from solid sandstone, absolutely exquisite. So if we were to look in any single place for a figure who might have inspired the wider dissemination of that idea of our Christmas card Balthazar, of a wealthy, wise, noble man traveling long distances on a camel, it actually probably would have been in medieval Mali, in the century before the Magi became a significant phenomenon. By the 11th century, Mali was developing some of the most kind of formidable sets of strategic allies. And it forges an empire which is unlike anything that West Africa had ever seen before. I mean, the area that it represents, about the size of the US, and in its period, more wealthy than any other African state, far more wealthy than the state that Lalibela would create. And it's truly formidable. This was a state that supplied the gold and the gilt for all of those sacraments and all of the paintings that the great churches of Europe sought. And at or near its peak, at the beginning of the 14th century, the very last of the founding dynasty of the Malian Empire, Abu Bakr Keita, he ascends the throne. And he inherits an empire which is truly, truly vast. And he faces an unlikely challenge. He was as ambitious as his forefathers, but his kingdom, it bounds the Sahara on one side and the Atlantic on the other. And he has scant options for expansion. All of his predecessors had expanded this vast kingdom, made it more wealthy, built greater kind of strategic alliances. But Abu Bakr Keita recognizes that his reign is not going to be defined by very much because there's so little in the way of expansion options that he can undertake. But he has a lieutenant, a man called Mansa Musa, and he plots with him the options. And Mansa Musa says, maybe it's time for us to consolidate. Maybe it's time for us not to think of expansion in terms of geography, but to think of other ways of expanding. But Abu Bakr is absolutely determined, and he looks to the sea. He decides that he wants to sail the Atlantic. And so he forges this amazing campaign to get some of the greatest shipbuilders in West Africa, and they craft him an amazing armada. He builds this vast fleet of ships, and the emperor puts his best soldiers, his best men on these ships, fills the ships with supplies and food and weaponry, and bids them farewell. Watches them sail off across the ocean, disappear over the horizon, and tells them, do not come back until you have reached the land on the opposite side. Many, many months later, a single vessel returns. They haven't found the mythical land on the other side of the Atlantic. And of course, the king, rather than be daunted by this, he's outraged. He's even more determined. And Mansa Musa, his trusted lieutenant, he tries to convince him. Perhaps this is a message. Perhaps this is a message about us, that we should be thinking about how we might consolidate what we've built and perhaps change direction and think of other options for expansion. But he's undeterred. And in 1312, he tries again. This time, he personally leads the expedition, traveling in an even bigger armada, thousands of fully laden ships, and neither the emperor nor the ships are ever seen again. And later that year, Mansa Musa ascends the throne. And he, as you would have guessed from his advice to his predecessor, he wants to define his regime, his time in power, differently. He knows that he has all the power, all of the money, all of the territory that he could possibly desire. There are very few frontiers that he can define, that he would need, that he can traverse. But he thinks there is options for perhaps shifting the paradigm. And early in his reign, he tries to stamp his authority. And he wants to suggest that tonal shift. And so he tries to kind of bring people kind of in this vast empire. If you think this is the size of the US, in which the only way of traveling is by horse. This is pre-camel. So that he has to think about how is he going to regulate this vast space. And so he begins to think about a new set of laws. He wants people to be more devout. He bans traditional religions. He asks the miners, who are the most powerful of all of the different groups that work under him, if they will stop their traditional religious practices. The miners respond, not by going on strike, because that would have probably meant that they would have risked their lives, but they reduce production of gold from his mines. And within a very short time, Mansa Musa capitulates, and he allows his miners to continue to practice their religions. And he recognizes that he needs to shift his thinking. He's learned an important lesson about governance, and how even for an emperor, leadership was built on a certain amount of reciprocity. And so after these early missteps, his regime shifts. He works to secure the trade routes. He rids the countryside of bandits. He opens up new trading opportunities to the north. Salt begins to flow across the trade routes. He brings in large numbers of camels, new sources of horses. And of course, he pushes further south into the gold-rich areas of what is today Ghana. And he opens up the Sahara, silks coming from China, spices from India, Persian fabrics, metalwork that comes from Europe, Arabian horses coming in large numbers. And these are exchanged for copper and gold. So they were a rich state, now they are a super state. Wealthier, I would imagine, than almost any other state in the world in that period. But these successes, they don't satisfy Mansa Musa. He grows frustrated. He wanted something that was even more prestigious than money. He sought, like Lalibela, knowledge, wisdom, learning. And he decided he was going to pursue it with a focus and a dedication of a general waging a major campaign. Now, he is a Muslim, and he is aware that the final of the 5 pillars of Islam suggest that you take a pilgrimage, you go on Hajj, that you show your dedication by expanding your consciousness by visiting Mecca and showing your respect to God. If you have the resources, Muslims are called upon to make that journey at least once within their lives. And Mansa Musa, he has the resources. But the trip to from medieval Mali to Mecca was not one that could be undertaken lightly. He knew that there were a number of preceding emperors who tried to make the journey. At least one had lost their life doing so. But Mansa Musa, he brought in all of those, all of that new stock of Arabian horses. He was an excellent rider. He had amazing stables. So he thought, this is worth taking on. But the scale of the challenge. Whilst his predecessor may have taken on the 2,000 miles across the Atlantic, from West Africa, the journey to Mecca across land is probably equally difficult. It's at least 3 times as far, but it's also across some of the most unforgiving terrain on earth. And anyone who's visited that part of the world, you know the temperatures that you're going to have to deal with. You know the lack of water that you're going to have to negotiate. But in 1324, 12 or so years after becoming emperor, 60,000 people left the Mali Empire with Mansa Musa. Most would walk every single hard mile. 8,000 were soldiers. 12,000 were personal staff. Some were members of his court, but most were just ordinary citizens who just wanted to be part of this historic moment. And they traveled with 80 camels. Each one of them was bearing 300 pounds of gold. And each night when they stopped, it was said to be like it was a whole camp, like a whole town was decamping in the desert. And they took with them everything they needed, even a mosque that they would assemble in the desert so that they could pray. Could you imagine the logistical complexity of shepherding so many people across such a dry and arid landscape? How would you have kept them safe? How would you have navigated the terrain? This was every bit as challenging as navigating a fleet across the Atlantic. No one had ever engaged upon a journey to Mecca in such style. And his arrival in Cairo in 1324 is greeted with grand celebration. Al-Makrizi, who is probably the greatest Egyptian historian of that time, he describes Mansa Musa's arrival. He's a young man with brown skin, a pleasant face, and a good figure, instructed in Malachite rite. He appeared amidst his companions, magnificently dressed and mounted, and surrounded by more than 10,000 subjects. He brought gifts and presents that amazed the eye with their beauty and splendor. And the Mamluk Sultan, one of the most powerful people in Northeast Africa, perhaps recognizing Mansa Musa as the richest man who probably ever lived. I mean, this is a man who, if you know, in terms of the calculations, people say he's more wealthy than, if you were to convert what he had then into contemporary terms, many times more wealthy than Elon Musk. You know, he's hugely wealthy. So he arrives with these camels full of gold. But even Mansa Musa was expected to understand Egyptian etiquette. He was meant to bow to his host, the Sultan. But if you think this wasn't just a Hajj, it wasn't just a religious journey, he was also there to make a kind of statement about Mali. And so, rather than lay prostrate, as he should have, in subservience to the Sultan, Mansa Musa kisses the ground and he praises Allah. And of course, the Mamluk Sultan is forced to welcome him into the court. Mansa Musa, he's a natural diplomat, and he knew that he had to accept local mores. But he was also not about to bow to anyone. And of course, the court are won over, the Sultan is won over, but even possibly more important, all of those early journalists, the people who wrote those kind of magnificent kind of books and reports, those travel books in that period, they are impressed with this figure that represents so many of those things that we have been identifying as the characteristics of a Balthazar. This man, he's wealthy, he's wise, he's good-looking, he's charismatic, but also he understands the politics of the age. And so they invite him to shelter in Cairo over the summer. And they know that this is going to be to their benefit because he is going to spend, and he does spend. In fact, he is so generous that he spends and he gives away so much that it's said that he collapses the price of gold for the next decade. So he then pushes on to Mecca. And after completing his pilgrimage, he stays to meet some of the great Islamic scholars and imams. And over the period of his Hajj, there are areas of Mecca that attract some of the finest thinkers of the age. And it's not just, as you might imagine, a period in which people just dedicate their time to praying. This is a time for diplomatic opportunity, for creating strategic alliances, for discussions between intellectuals from different parts of the medieval world. You know, they're there to exchange ideas and gossip. And one can imagine of the sorts of people that he would have met. People who would have traveled from the newly established university at Salamanca, from the ancient Berber centers of intellectual excellence in North Africa. They would have probably followed him on that last leg from Cairo. But also people would have hailed from the courts of Venice, from the madrasas of the Ottoman Empire. And we know that Mansa Musa is utterly entranced. And as he makes arrangements for his return, he invites a number of these intellectuals to follow him, including a group who claim that they are actually descendants of the Prophet. And amongst the people that he asked to come back is one of the greatest poets and architects of the time, Abu al-Sahili. And now he is an incredible architect. He is one of the architects that actually worked on the buildings in Granada. I'm sure some of you have been there and you've seen those amazing kind of complexes of buildings that are designed to deal with incredibly warm temperatures through amazing architecture and flows of water. And he recognizes that he wants that sort of thinking, those sorts of architectural technologies at home. So he takes a number of these architects, but particularly Abu al-Sahili, who is a superstar, sort of Norman Foster of his time, back with him to Mali. And al-Sahili would build one of the most beautiful mosques in Africa, in Timbuktu, on the edge of the desert, a building conceived in the very exact proportions of the central square in Mecca. And as much as being a pilgrimage, it's also a statement to the world about the wealth, the ambition, and the intellectual culture of Mali. And in so many ways, he was a magus because he's rich, he's wise, and he's noble. He's generous. And the news of his journey, it creates waves that would reverberate across the Western world, the Middle East and beyond. And 50 years later, Abraham Cresques, the cartographer, he immortalizes Mansa Musa holding a gold nugget on the edge of the great Catalan Atlas for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So it's an image of a particular kind of African wisdom and wealth that would become a point of inspiration for European artists for centuries to come. It's not just about wealth and power, but a kind of distant perspective that would evoke intrigue, even for the protector of Christian faith. So this is the Holy Roman Emperor who looks to this man, this image, with a degree of envy and respect. So, Mansa Musa, he has all the characteristics of a magi, except for his faith. He was aristocratic, wise, wealthy, generous, devout. He traversed continents in pursuit of knowledge. That image of his caravan crossing the desert laden with beautiful things is an image that might have been taken from a Christmas card. But for his faith, he would be the perfect model for Balthazar. That European quest pushed Europeans to build deeper and deeper connections in Africa. And this pendant mask, created in the early 16th century for a Nigerian king or Oba called Essegy, it's absolutely gorgeous. And it was made to honor his mother, Idia. And it's carved with incredible skill from ivory, the material that would attract Portuguese traders down the West African coast, bringing with them copper and coral. It's fascinating, but a very brief period of the last generations of African rulers who saw Europeans as their vassals, as their servants. Here, if you look very carefully at her hair, threaded through her hair are not beads, but the heads of European traders. Like currency. It's an essay in power, an essay in confidence. But within 2 generations, there had been a critical shift. Europeans had established a permanent presence on the West African coast. And as we know, settlements, protectorates, imbalanced trade deals, bad strategic alliances, and then colonialism would follow. And they would all combine to devastate the continent hundreds of thousands forcibly enslaved, millions killed in wars, resistance struggles, the systematic reconfiguration of the economies to benefit Europe, the undermining and the dissolution of indigenous cultural infrastructure, and to assuage the guilt of the colonists, an investment in appalling racist theory. And that would contaminate intellectual culture for generations. I would actually argue that we still live under that influence. And the Enlightenment philosophers who would craft the intellectual culture that underpinned the period simply excluded Africa from the pantheon of classical civilizations. If you remember where we started, this idea of a constellation of 3 equal regions, each one with its intellectual and cultural traditions. Suddenly, Africa is excluded. And men like Hegel, Kant, figures like Locke and Hume, the people who crafted the Enlightenment, crafted the ideas that underpin so much that we still rely upon when we think about culture in the West. They wrote that when they sought to find recognizable forms of intellectual tradition in Africa, when they sought out wisdom, they simply couldn't find what they were looking for. And the cultural archaeology of that historical willful blindness to African intellectual achievement, it's still evident. Its legacy impacts our understanding of the world. But the lingering memory of Balthazar, the wise, spiritual African, persisted. Our noble, wise, religious African would have to find a new form. And this is at the peak of the British slave trade, William Hall painted this compelling painting of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. It's the first British portrait of a named black African Muslim and freed slave. And in part, what made him so loved was his religious conviction. Though not a Christian, Diallo was an educated noble cleric from West Africa who heralded from the courts that had generations before produced Mansa Musa. And he would have stood out. In 1731, at the age of 29, he was captured and transported to work on a plantation in America by the Royal African Company. After being imprisoned for trying to escape, he met the lawyer Thomas Blewett. Blewett had become aware of Diallo's aristocratic birth and his exceptional intellect, and in 1734 he arranged his passage to England. Whilst in Britain, his story and his education gave him the opportunity to mix in aristocratic and intellectual circles, including the Duke of Portland and Sir Hans Sloane, the founder of the British Museum. And he helped Hans Sloane with Arabic and Quranic translations. Sloane also arranged for Diallo to be presented at the court of George II, and he was later elected a member of the Gentlemen's Society at Spalding, a society that boasted as its members men like Isaac Newton, well, a whole range of the great intellectual elite of the period. And his supporters additionally arranged for him to sit for this portrait in his traditional dress, carrying a copy of the Quran around his neck. It's not like most other portraits of the period. It has an explicit manifesto. It's meant to appeal to your better nature and to question slavery. And it worked. Diallo was brought out of slavery through public appeal. And after nearly a year in England, he was one of the few victims of the transatlantic slave trade to return to his family in Africa. It's a curious portrait. He doesn't look toward a horizon or to our left or right. He doesn't gaze beyond us. He looks directly at us. He's not imploring. He simply, modestly is. Although this was commissioned with the support of the slave-trading Royal African Company, it's an essay in abolition. It sets the tone for the kind of emotional, ethical advocacy that great abolitionist painting would achieve across the century. In his eyes is the look of recognition and of recollection. He knows us. We know him. He's a man with a hinterland and with loved ones. This is no empty vessel, no mask, no nameless slave, but neither is he angry, vengeful, pained, nor someone cowed. He's inherently noble, aristocratic. We know that it's his lineage, we know that in part it's his lineage, his education, his family, his wealth. The way that he fulfills our romantic desire for Balthazar. It's these things as much as anything else that the abolitionists really sought in him, and ultimately the thing that saved him. And that romantic hankering for a noble, wise, wealthy African persisted. A decade later, William Answer arrived in London. His father, a prince and a slave trader on the Gold Coast, had sent him to London to get an education and make business contacts. But he was tricked by the ship's captain and, like Diallo, sold into slavery. William, too, was an aristocrat. His father, another favoured client of the Royal African Company. So his case became an immediate cause célèbre. And after 4 years working on plantations in Barbados, he too was freed and brought to London. And by the time he arrives in our capital, Dr. Johnson's Gentleman's Magazine had already made Answer her star. And the story, like Diallo, touched a nerve. It seemed to almost exactly follow the narrative of one of the most popular plays of the time, Thomas Southern's Urunuku. Southern's play had become a powerful propaganda weapon in the armory of the anti-slavery movement. Even David Garrick, Britain's most celebrated actor, blacked up to play the central role. And here in London, not far from where we are today, in a London that thrived on the proceeds of slavery, yet could not quite comfortably rest with it, in a city that could choose to ignore the thousands of destitute people of African descent that were on its streets, yet at the same time flocked to see Southern's play in the Garrick. A young man who personified these tensions cut quite a poignant figure. And he sits in a box and he watches the play. It's said that whilst he watched, most of the audience actually looked at him rather than the stage, but it was a poignant moment for him to reflect on the complexities of this period. And like Diallo, he has a portrait painted, and here by Gabriel Matthias, a very popular print is also made by John Faber. And toward the end of Answer's stay in London, toward the end of Answer's stay in London, he is given an opportunity to visit the royal court. And he begins to realize, he as a royal, some of the complexities of what he has just lived through. He returns home, and one of the saddest bits of this story is he, like Diallo, goes back to slave trading. He's a worldly, confident, almost brash Balthazar. Here is a man whose countenance deals with the question, am I not a man, differently to the Hor Diallo painting. He doesn't ask you to search within you to find the moral wherewithal to respect him. Answer demands respect. There's almost a subtle arrogance mixed with the sadness in the corner of his eyes. He is the New Testament figure, humble nobility that asks more of us. Answer and Diallo had unique vantage points because, unfortunately, because of both their race and their nobility. that allowed them to see both above and below the veneer of polite society. And that perspective of sitting on the edge of the canvas gives them a place from which they're well placed to muse upon the complexities of what had happened around them and to cast judgment on us. And both of these paintings, I think, they're paintings which ask more of us. They aren't just portraits of a person, they're portraits of a time, portraits of us. Both were aristocratic slave traders cast into slavery and then freed to become living arguments for abolition. But ironically, sadly, each man would return to slave trading later in their lives. And the year that Diallo was captured and sold into slavery, William Hogarth painted Rake's Progress, completed in 1732. And it tells a story that people in the 18th century probably would have been gossiping about every day of the week. It's the story of a young man who inherits a fortune from his miserly father and thinks that money is going to buy him love and power and happiness. And we somehow know that this isn't going to end well. In the second scene, Tom, our protagonist, is caught teetering between two worlds. You can see him in the pink. He teetering between two worlds. Behind him is the roughness and the honesty of the street, and ahead, the affected world of a fashionable society. But this is the critical scene. This third frame. Night has fallen. The lamp has been discarded. The die is cast. And Tom, on the right-hand side, sits seated with two women around him, is drunk. This is a brothel. And you can see the patterns kind of flowing across the canvas, leading your gaze across caresses, people pickpocketing. You can see there's a kind of Chinese trader almost throttling the very young-looking prostitute. But at the back, on the far right, you'll see a young woman of African descent, a maid. And even though she's right on the edge of the edge of the canvas, even though you might not notice her immediately, I think she's critical to this narrative and to this story. She smiles knowingly. She's looking across the canvas at the woman who's just come in, who's looking shocked. And in front of the woman is a man carrying a large silver dish with a candle in front of it. And this pewter shiny dish illuminates the scene, illuminates for us to see and to understand what is happening. In the gloom, we can make out a reflection. What is it? It's us. We are culpable. For Hogarth, the black figure has become the opportunity to break the frame, to look across, to cast judgment by passing part of the blame back to us. He wants us to make some sort of moral assertion, to begin to navigate these ideas ourselves and not to feel that we can sit on the edge and just gaze at this scene as something that we can laugh and muse upon. We are responsible for our actions. We can make a difference. The light will find us. This is about being on the edge of the canvas, like Mansa Musa was on the edge of the world. The view from the periphery being, in some way, the clearest. They are the people who offer the context, who pass the judgment, who become the arbiters, the people we exclude, they become the judge. And one of the reasons that I was so keen to talk about this and to do it here at St. James's is because these patterns repeat themselves. This is the place where Ottobah Cugoano in 1773 was baptized. At the back is the font where he was baptized. I think about 13 years old, in which he, as a young person who came from the Gold Coast, the place where my ancestors were born, was taken on a ship, forced into slavery, finds himself in Britain. And it's in this church, amongst incredibly generous, thoughtful people, that he finds a kind of salvation and becomes not just free, but offers an opportunity of freedom through others, through ideas. And he crafts not just literature about the appalling treatment of peoples of color, of peoples of African descent, but also he wants to write something about human dignity. It's a beautiful thing, an incredible story, but also kind of deeply affected. I mean, we came in search of Balthazar, and I mean, I probably haven't told you the story that you might have wanted to hear, but I think we found something of him. And we could probably never find him wholly, because I actually think he was, in part, created by our own desires and our needs. He was conceived at the periphery. If you look at those paintings, he was the figure who always sat on the edge, out of focus. But perhaps the guilt that shadows the imperial age, guilt that I think the ghosts of which still linger for many of us, it needed a face. And I think the noble, enigmatic judge that was Balthazar is a poignant one. I'll stop there. I think I've probably spoken too much. But thank you.
I think the only thing I'd disagree with all evening was you ending by saying you spoke too much. I could have listened on and on. Thank you so much. It was such a rich, and lecture. I will be thinking about it for many, many days. And there'll be an opportunity in a moment to ask questions, and Ray is standing there poised with a microphone, but let me claim chair's privilege of asking the first one while everyone else is thinking. There was so much that I'm kind of wrestling with and thinking about. But first question, what I was fascinated by was the way in which you traced the Balthazar through the medieval texts and then into the era of the slave trade. Have you traced and noticed a dropping out of Balthazar once the slave trade began? Is there something that happens? I was wondering whether there was something about the kind of the corporate psyche that meant that the artists painted differently once the slave trade was underway.
What I was interested in is how we need that figure, because I think we identify both ourselves with those people who sit on the periphery, because I think at some point that is us all. But additionally, that around the Balthazarian figure, that there is this kind of idea of the exotic, of possibly an answer to some of the bigger kind of questions that we ask. And even in that period of the height of the slave trade, when we chose to denigrate, degrade a race in the most appalling ways, we wanted to simultaneously find those exceptional opportunities in which we could reify particular people. And we sought to do that by saying there was a kind of particular sort of nobility of specific people. And that, I think, is the kind of Balthazarian kind of idea of a kind of nobility. And in all of those figures, they sought to kind of define them as being in some way aristocratic. Even Kugwano, that he is someone who is, that he's connected to the aristocracy in Cape Coast. That's how that they write his story. And it's somehow, that is part of what makes him acceptable. Because you imagine in that period, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people of African descent who were living destitute on London streets. And they selected this one, and they had to then kind of construct that kind of narrative of aristocracy as a way of redeeming the kind of wider racism, of a kind of an acceptance that even in the way in which we emancipate people, that racism would continue to pervade.
Yeah, really interesting, thank you. So, it's opportunity for questions. I'm seeing hands flying up. There's a gentleman right next to you, Ray, and then we'll go along, and then we'll go towards the back later on.
Hi. Actually, I'd like to answer your question, actually.
Please do.
About the change in the way that images of people of colour were produced. I think Gus hinted at write-ins around this, and some of the writers responsible for the way that the perception changes are in fact people such as Giovanni Battista della Porta, who published in 1586, Petrus Campus, who published in 1772, Johann Caspar Lavater, who published in 1775, and they published ideas around how, as it were, inhuman people of colour were. And I think their publications, along with the Enlightenment thinkers that Gus mentioned, are really largely responsible for the change in the way that people of colour are seen in images. That's it for me.
Thank you. And then the gentleman on the front row, and then there was somebody towards the back. I don't know if you can see, Ray, lady with a hand up towards the back.
Thank you for a really fascinating lecture. It was marvellous. Just one very brief comment and then a question. The comment is, of course, that slavery was not something that was introduced by Europeans. I mean, Mansa Musa himself took 12,000 slaves with him when he crossed the Sahara. He wasn't somebody who had to be introduced to slavery. And Ethiopia has slavery written into its history to its very foundation, as where it exported them up the Nile and across to Arabia. So it was not something that was introduced by Europeans. But I wanted to ask you whether the V&A is doing anything to try to recapture the heritage that's been lost in Tigray, in particular, in the terrible wars that inflicted it in the last, over 2 years, ended a year ago. And so many of the monasteries, churches have been looted, and so many of the artifacts have been taken. And I wonder if the V&A is doing anything now to begin to catalogue, to try to regain that and to return it to the Ethiopians.
I mean, I agree with you that African states were complicit in the slave trade. I mean, that is a fact, and it needs to absolutely be acknowledged. But there is something about the compounding of the appallingness of slavery with racial theory, and the way in which, even beyond the point of emancipation, that racial theory pervades, that is, I mean, that is very difficult to deal with. And I think, in part, that what we are negotiating today by way of the kind of legacies and the sort of racism that still continues, is dealing with not some of the sorts of kind of structured areas of kind of racism in things like kind of slavery, but with the legacies of the sorts of ways in which people strove to justify it. It was the sorts of things that the previous kind of gentleman was talking about. It was the theories, it was the writings, it was the sorts of things that were constructed to underpin those systems that pervaded even beyond the point of slavery being outlawed. And those are the things that we continue to live with. Those, I mean, I can still remember when people talked about African art as primitive art, in which, that I kind of grew up in times in which my teachers would be constantly telling me things which I knew were kind of wrong and that I knew were kind of explicitly racist, but that was just part of the kind of materials that kind of backed up education in that period. It's taken us a long time to get to where we are, but the place where we are is the point at which we're asking questions about how do we build the materials so that we can teach our children adequately well about Africa. We aren't even in a place where we can really do that. I mean, constantly the thing I'm asked by teachers, where are the materials so I can... We're still in the generation in which we're shaping. The deficit is so great as a result of this. So I agree with you in terms of that first point, but the legacies of that, the pervasive racism, is something that we have to continue to negotiate. And then on the V&A, and I mean, the V&A hasn't traditionally had had a key focus, a strategic focus on Africa. If you look at its collections about sort of 30 years ago, it did not collect strategically within Africa, but that has changed, and its collections that were kind of from Africa, many of those things they had come through colonial wars, through strategic raids, and problematic provenance, appalling kind of contextualization, and that work has begun. But we, as you say, have to now, as a country, begin to think of how we address some of the sorts of legacies of having had relationships with countries across the African continent and benefited from those relationships in a whole host of different ways. I think it's time for us to give back, to pay back, and to support governments that are trying to fight and ensure democracy, and to fight and ensure that their cultural heritage is well represented and conserved, on the continent itself. At the moment, we can tell most stories of pre-colonial African civilizations better through the national collections of most Western countries than we can in their places of origin. That over the course of our lifespan must change. It must change. I mean, so much of what I tried to talk about today is we've got to think about making a moral difference in terms of how we think about our collections. It's not just good enough to think about our collections as just telling stories and that we can reflect upon them, good or bad. We need to feel that they are underpinned with some kind of moral integrity. So I think we have to, at some point, recalibrate some of these things, and to do it with boldness, and to do it kind of thinking about both the past but also the future.
Now, there was somebody whose hand went up right at the start. There we go.
You've spoken a bit about...
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Do you want to stand up? So I often think it's easier to hear someone when you can see them as well.
You've spoken about how the image and the figure of Balthazar was sort of crafted and influenced by trade and imperialism in early medieval Europe. I was wondering if you could maybe speak more about the lasting legacy you think it's had. I think during the talk, I thought the first thing that came to my head was thinking about Shakespeare's Othello and how he similarly described to Balthazar as like exotic, Moorish, a Berber. And I was wondering if you see the figure of Balthazar as in any way a sort of predecessor to Orientalist art and culture. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And absolutely. I mean, the legacies of a particular vision of Africa, and I think that probably that many people who wrote about, I mean, if you think about the Thomas Southern's Orinoco, that I imagine that in crafting that narrative, that he felt that it was written out of respect, that he was trying to talk to what he saw as appalling treatment of peoples of African descent in that period. And so he wrote about this noble African, as he saw them, who was cast into slavery and then freed. But it plays with so many of the kind of burgeoning racist stereotypes and cements them, that even in the sort of progress that he may have been wanting to catalyze, he actually undermines it through actually crafting something which is inherently racist. And we now have to deal with the legacies of that and think about how we can deconstruct some of that, so that young people who are wanting to renegotiate their relationship with these pasts and think again about how we deal with issues of race and equity, that they can come into our spaces in museums, that they can read these histories, and they can do it with a degree of confidence. And I think we need to craft those narratives that can look back across this history with real honesty, and as you say, ask those questions, point and actually say what needs to be said about periods of time in which we need to feel shamed, in which we need to reflect. And the thing is that it isn't for us to do the same, that we can set an example for younger people. I mean, there's a fascinating period to live through in which the young feel like the ones who have grabbed the moral compass of this period and are demanding of baby boomers and of older generations that they shift and they reflect. And I think there's a great opportunity for us to renegotiate some of these things. And history is there for us to learn from. And what we mustn't do is to simplify it through fear and not wanting to actually face into it with honesty. There are appalling chapters, and we shouldn't just be mortified and trapped by shame, and we need to face into these things and to learn from them. And I do think that the young have the appetite and the ambition to do so, and that gives me real hope. And in my work as a museum director, the thing I seek is to tell the truth and to be open and to be clear that what we are doing is part of a journey. We do not have all of the answers. We want to renegotiate a shift in our understanding, but to do it in partnership with all of you, the public, the people who own our collections. Let's craft a new history that speaks to this moment and speaks to this opportunity for equity. And I think about this particular space, which was why I was so keen to come and do this, because in this very space, were people who had the bravery, who had the imagination, the ambition to think about what the future might be. They weren't encumbered by just the conditions and the mores of the present. And, you know, I look to the young and they seem to have that same ambition.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a really good place to stop with that great vision for how we can make the future so much better. I've got a couple of notices before I give the final thanks. Today is a very big day for art and Christianity. Not only do we have the lecture here, our second annual lecture, but we have also launched the new branding for Ecclesiart, and it is absolutely brilliant, I can assure you. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about Ecclesiart and seeing it in practice, Ray, do you want to come just a little bit? Ray will be sitting at the back by the computer and will be able to show you what you can see through the website and something of the new branding and talk you through some of those images. So please do go and talk to her if you're interested. Can I also say that there are so many fabulous things that art and Christianity are doing, and there are lots and lots of projects in the pipeline. There's a new book, there's an auction, there's all sorts of things going on, but we can only really survive with the help of generous friends and benefactors. So if tonight has tempted you to join art and Christianity, then I know Marie, who is standing at the back and waving currently, would be delighted to speak to you and to tell you how to do that. Another thing that you might be interested in is that, as well as an annual lecture, there's an annual retreat weekend, and this year it will take place between the 13th and 15th of September in the Black Mountains in South Wales. There's lots of details about it on the Art and Christianity website if you're interested. I think that's all of the notices that I've been given to give. So let me end by saying a heartfelt and overwhelming thank you to Gus. I can't remember the last time I have been both absolutely riveted by what you were saying and had my imagination sparked in so many different directions. It was a tour de force, absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure you'd want to join me in thanking him for being here tonight.
You're very kind. Thank you.
And don't forget, there's refreshments over there for the end of the evening.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
Absolutely. So I now want to go. Let's talk for hours because